When buying a new car, many factors come into play to help make a decision. The price, the fuel economy, the reliability, and of course, the performance. I would say these 4 factors are some of the most common when looking for a new car. For some, fuel economy is a priority, and for others, performance is. Wherever you are on this spectrum, I think we can all agree that having a car that is crazy slow is awful, sometimes even dangerous. In 2024, the slowest car for sale is the Mitsubishi Mirage with 78 horsepower mated into a CVT transmission. Now, I'm no mechanic, but all I hear about CVTs is that they are garbage, horrible, awful, unreliable, all of the above. Anyway, 0 to 60 for these cars comes in around 12.8 seconds. The next slowest car goes to the Nissan Kicks at 9.7 seconds to 60, and the third goes to the Subaru Crosstrek at 9.5 seconds. For those of you who grew up in the 70s and 80s, these numbers aren't half bad. Actually, to have a sub 10-second car was typically uncommon and decent, especially in the early 80s. In 2024, we have Camrys hitting 60 in 6 to 7 seconds. Back in the 80s, 6 to 7 seconds was actually super impressive. For example, a 1982 Camaro Z28 with an automatic transmission hit 60 in 8.6 seconds. And oddly enough, in this instance, the auto was quicker than if it was manual. An 82 Mustang GT hit 60 in 8 seconds and an 82 Corvette in 8.1 seconds. As the 80s progressed, things started to pick up again by around 85-86. When I say that, I'm not referring to cars like a Festivia or a Silverado. Of course, those vehicles aren't performance oriented. So cars like a Crown Vic or 98 were still plenty slow. I'm referring to things like the Mustang, Camaro, Daytona Turbo Z, Shelby GLHS, etc. The early 80s, however, had some of the slowest cars I have ever made a video on. Half the cars on this list take 19 to 20 seconds to reach 60, and most of these cars are from 1980 to 1984. By hearing me talk for the first few minutes, you would realize that I'm going by 0 to 60 times or 0 to 100 kilometers everywhere else in the world. When I was making this list, that was the only factor I considered in determining the ranking system. I think it's a pretty fair way to go about it. Of course, when comparing sports cars to one another, many other factors than 0 to 60 times play a role. In this case, 7 of the 10 cars are regular family sedans, and it just seems fair to me. With that being said, these numbers aren't 100% accurate for many reasons. Across different websites, there can be an entire 1-second spread from one another. Also, there's probably going to be cars that I'm gonna miss. For example, finding a 0 to 60 for an early 80s Ford Econoline, the E350, with the extended chassis, the smallest engine offered, which was an inline-6, made it into a 3-speed auto is damn near impossible to find. I'm sure the 0 to 60 is dreadful, but I don't have any numbers because no one tested things like this. One more thing, commercial vehicles and heavy-duty trucks like a F700 or a G30 van won't be included for obvious reasons. Alright, with all of that said, here are the top 10 slowest American cars from the 1980s. 1984 and 1985 Lincoln Continental Diesel. If you were like me, then you had no idea that these came with a diesel engine. Partly the reason being is only around 1,500 units were sold. Coming out in '84, GM's diesels have already lost their reputation. Ford, being the fly on the wall, watched it all go down. So the idea was to partner with BMW, who had a much better reputation for building diesel engines, and slap it in a Continental. This partnership seemed like a far better alternative than building small block diesels in-house. Under the hood was a BMW 2.4-liter inline-6 turbo diesel mated into a 4-speed automatic made by ZF. So the whole powertrain was sourced from BMW. 114 horsepower and 155 pound-feet of torque for a car that weighs over 3,500 pounds, well, you would quickly realize that that's nowhere near enough power. 0 to 60 in around 14.5 seconds. The Mark 7 also had this diesel option, and on screen is a pretty cool face-off with the Mercedes 500 SEC. I think that's what it is. My Euro knowledge is dog water. Anyway, 24 miles per gallon compared to the 16 with the V8 is definitely an upgrade, but at a cost. 1981 and 1982 Ford Granada wagon and sedan with Ford's 2.3-liter inline-4 Lima engine. Honestly, any car on the Fox platform with this dreadful 140 cubic inch inline-4 could be on this list. Unfortunately, I don't have any 0 to 60 times with this specific engine. However, a 1982 Granada 4-door with the 3.3 liter Thrift Power 6 did 0 to 60 in 16.4 seconds. Those engines produce 87 horsepower and 154 pound-feet of torque. The Lima engines during this time made around the same horsepower but 118 pound-feet of torque. So it's safe to assume that 0 to 60 time would be worse. The Thunderbirds did not come with the inline 4, but they did have that inline 6. They actually weighed 100 to 200 pounds more than a Granada. Having around 90 horsepower with a car that weighs over 3,000 pounds is insane. Even with the 4.2 liter V8 in a Thunderbird, 0 to 60 in over 15 seconds. Also, the Granadas and Thunderbirds and Fairmonts with the 3-speed automatic had the worst performance. I mean, these transmissions were introduced in the 60s. I could spend even more time on this, there's just so much information. Basically, the base model engines with the base transmissions had awful performance. In terms of numbers, I really don't know, so these Fords could rank even higher on this list with those inline 4s. 1980 Chevy LUV. If you've never heard of these, well, I haven't either until I made this video. These were rebadged Isuzu Fasters sold in the States from 1972 until 1980, so these just made the cutoff. LUV stands for Light Utility Vehicle, and it wasn't uncommon to have rebadged imports during this time. One truck that comes to mind is the Dodge D50, a rebadged Mitsubishi. I believe Ford had their own version as well. Anyway, consumers could either buy a 2-door or a 4-door configuration, and these trucks were pretty bare bones. There's absolutely nothing wrong with that though. If anything, I think some of the trucks nowadays are too luxurious and have a completely different role than they did back in the day. Most US spec LUVs came with an Isuzu 1.8 liter 4-cylinder that makes 80 horsepower and 95 pound-feet of torque, 0 to 60 in around 19 seconds. As I was editing the footage for this video, apparently for 2 years, the states received the 2nd gen LUV. One of the engines offered was a 2.2 liter 55 horsepower diesel engine, 0 to 60 in, well, let's find out. (1985) Cadillac Fleetwood with the 4.3 liter diesel. When I was talking about Ford and their collaboration with BMW, I mentioned how GM's diesels had an awful reputation. And they did, however, the V6 diesel alternatives weren't horrible in terms of reliability, at least compared to those 5.7s. In 1982, the first V6 diesel appeared called the LT6 and later the LT7. Well, apparently for 1985, GM thought, let's give it another go, and the LS2 variant was launched. It's funny because it was discontinued that same year. 86 horsepower and 165 pound-feet of torque, which was around the same rating as the earlier V6 diesels. These were only available in GM's C-body cars, so the Fleetwood, Electra, 98, etc. Fleetwoods of this generation, and every generation, are some very heavy cars. 35 to 3,900 pounds with 86 horsepower is again insane. 0 to 60 in around 19.8 seconds. 1981 Chrysler Newport with the 3.7 liter Slant 6. Just like the Fox bodies, these engines were in a few of the Chryslers at the time. The Newport was on Chrysler's R-body platform along with the Grand Fury and St. Regis. The 5th Avenue and New Yorker were also on this platform, but they did not receive this engine. The reason being is those variants were more upscale as opposed to the others. Chrysler during this time was struggling compared to Ford and Chevy. What's changed, to be honest? They didn't really have the funds to create new platforms like the others. This R-body was sort of an attempt to downsize. They shared similarities with the B-bodies, but they were still giant. For 1979, across Dodge and Chrysler, they sold pretty well, but for 1980, less than 10,000 Newports sold. Under the hood was Chrysler's 3.7 liter Slant 6 that had been around for a while at this point, 85 horsepower and 165 pound-feet of torque, 0 to 60 in around 19.9 seconds. Chevy Chevette with the 1.8 liter diesel. I'm sure many of you guys watching remember these things. Over its 12-year production run, over 2.7 million Chevettes sold. Anyone who has owned one of these or driven one would tell you that these things weren't built to last. Kind of the same story with the Pinto and Vega, just super cheap and economical. If you own one, just know I'm not trashing you in any way. My first car was rusted to all hell, so much that the driver door would sag if opened. In 1982, a few years after this model was introduced, a 1.8-liter Isuzu diesel was now optional. The only transmission paired to this engine was an Isuzu 5-speed manual, and it wasn't available with AC. Speaking of AC, I'm sure with the times I've been giving, add even more time if the car's AC was on. When it comes to power, and I'm sure you've noticed a pattern with these early 80s American/imported diesels, well, there is none. Apart from the BMW diesel and the Lincoln, most of them weren't turbocharged or direct injected. With that being said, these Chevettes made around 51 horsepower, 0 to 60 in around 21.1 seconds.
Employer drives a diesel car because he can afford to save money. Diesel fuel and maintenance costs are less.
I drive a diesel car because I know it'll get better mileage per gallon and it's more maintenance free.
I drive a Chevette diesel because I want all the things those rich folks want, but I don't want to pay status prices. I could have 6 Chevettes for the price of one Mercedes or 3 for the price of a Peugeot.
1981 Cadillac Fleetwood Brougham with the 5.7 diesel. GM slapped these into a lot of different models across each of their brands, so it really doesn't matter what car it is, if it had this engine, it was super slow. The Fleetwood Brougham is one of the heavier models weighing over 4,000 pounds, and so that is what I went with. The design for this engine was based on the old 350 V8 and was introduced in 1978. Of course, there were V6 options introduced later on. Unlike those V6 alternatives though, these were super unreliable. GM took many shortcuts when designing this gasoline to diesel conversion. I don't really want to get into the specifics because this is a list video and I have to keep moving forward. Anyway, the Fleetwood Brougham is such a beautiful luxury sedan from this time, it's one of my favorites. However, with 105 horsepower and 205 pound-feet of torque, 0 to 60 in 21.5 seconds is horrendous and even dangerous. The people buying these Cadillacs weren't trying to go fast or anything, but there's a fine line between getting there and not. I've never gotten the chance to drive anything with the 5.7 diesel. Given the popularity back in the day, I'm looking forward to reading all of your personal stories. It's one of my favorite things to do after uploading a video. 1985 Ford Tempo 4-door with yet again another diesel. The good old first-gen Ford Tempo was introduced in 1984 and lasted until 1987. Standard in these cars was a 2.3-liter 4-cylinder, but there was an optional diesel engine. You probably guessed it, it was not built in-house, rather it was from Mazda. I've noticed, at least during the 80s, each of the big three had their own designated import manufacturer. GM had Isuzu, Ford had Mazda, and Chrysler had Mitsubishi for the most part. The Ranger and Escort also had a diesel option as well. Actually, the Escort and Tempo had the same 2-liter from Mazda, as did the Ranger. So if anything, the Ranger should have been on this list, as they were slightly heavier than the others. The 2-liter Mazda diesel was good for 52 horsepower and 82 pound-feet of torque, 0 to 60 in around 21.8 seconds with the manual. I have no info on the Ranger because they were only out for a year, but I would guess another 3 to 4 seconds on top of that. Most consumers did not opt for the diesel as it was an additional charge, so with these second gens, there was no longer a diesel option. But if you did opt for it on the first gens, expect to get 45 miles per gallon, super impressive even by today's standards. 1987 Cadillac Fleetwood Brougham Limo. Apparently in December of 1987, Car and Driver decided to put President Reagan's limo to the test. I know it's a bit of an oddball entry, I was debating if I should even add it, but I guess it spices things up. I'm going to directly quote Car and Driver because this is pretty funny. Making the earth move is something that the 5-liter Oldsmobile V8 under the hood simply can't do, no matter how hard it's throttled. With 3 tons of road mugging weight virtually denying the presence of an engine, these small V8's 140 humble horses can't begin to cut the mustard. In fact, they can't even unscrew the lid. 0 to 60 for the limo was tested at 23.5 seconds with an average fuel economy of 11 miles per gallon. Inside the limo was nothing shy of elegance and luxury with a sticker price of over $200 grand in 1987. 1982 Pontiac 1000 with the 1.6-liter made it into a 3-speed auto. It's crazy to think that this gasoline engine is slower than a Chevette with a diesel. I'm not going to beat around the bush here, this was Motor Week's slowest car ever to be featured. Are you ready for the 0 to 60? 0 to 60 in the Pontiac 1000 is 30 seconds. From 40 miles per hour to 55, that took 12.8 seconds.
This Pontiac 1000 set several Motor Week records, including the slowest 0 to 60 time we've yet recorded, nearly 30 seconds.
Under the hood was a 1.6 liter, good for 65 horsepower and 85 pound-feet of torque. The biggest flaw with this spec is the automatic transmission. It would struggle to downshift. With the manual though, 0 to 60 took around half the amount of time. And there you have it, the top 10 slowest American cars from the 1980s. Like I said earlier in this video, I'm sure I'm missing a lot of possible entries. Again, finding 0 to 60 times for these cars was not easy, so just keep that in mind. I do sure hope you enjoyed this list video. These are usually very fun to make, there's just more variety and I can learn a lot more. I wasn't born in the 80s, I couldn't even imagine what it must have been like to drive around in these cars. It shows me a completely different perspective. With all that said, I hope you all have a great week, and I will try to see you all next week.